I have just completed The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. So, is the game really as good as it looks? So yes, this is a slightly different video from usual. This is just me sharing my impressions of Echoes of Wisdom, having just completed it. I will, in the next little while, do a more in-depth analysis of the game mechanics and other aspects with a view to looking at the future of the franchise, but game releases such as these are so rare, and I just want to bask in it for a moment. The major part of the video will be spoiler light, focusing only on things you can glean from the trailers, and all the footage will also be from the trailers. However, in the tail end, I'll say goodbye to everybody except people who have already enjoyed the game to talk about the game's ending. There are also timestamps so you can see where everything is. So the first thing to say is that my expectations going into this game were overall very high. I loved Grezzo's work on Link's Awakening, which is one of my favourite games of all time, and I also loved the concept of the echoes. Having Zelda in the lead made for an interesting twist, and I'm all for the incorporation of the freer Tears of the Kingdom style mechanics into the 2D game series, while I also enjoy traditional dungeons. In this sense, Echoes of Wisdom sounded like it had the makings of the perfect Zelda experience, and I will say that broadly speaking, it met those expectations. There are certainly some parts that work less well overall, but if you're thinking about whether to get into Echoes of Wisdom, my advice would be very much, yes, this is a really terrific title. So look, let's get some of the most common criticisms that I've seen out of the way. Firstly, the frame rate. I know this issue dogged Link's Awakening to some degree, and I have seen people saying that it's worse in Echoes of Wisdom, and I realise this makes me sound like some kind of technological heathen, but I'm really not that sensitive to this stuff. If you compare frame rates side by side, I'll notice, but if I'm caught up in a play experience, I'm just highly unlikely to notice frame rate dips unless they're incredibly obvious, and to be honest, I never notice them here. For those people who do get annoyed by this kind of thing, I can appreciate it would be annoying, but it honestly didn't even register for me. The second thing I've seen some people say is that they're not fans of the art style, or at least didn't want it reused after Link's Awakening. I am a fan of the overall look as a stylistic choice, although the one thing I don't really rate is the use of blurring around the edges to try to force the diorama-style illusion of depth. It's not just that it's a bit irritating and distracting, but also there are times when you're high up where some sections lower down are visible and some not, in a way that doesn't make sense, and it just makes the whole thing look a little bit glitchy. This is one of the few things that bother me about Link's Awakening as a remake too, but it's a pretty minor quibble. The third criticism I've seen is that of item management, of the many echo abilities you acquire, and this is probably a more fair criticism. And look, it's not the worst thing in the world. You can get by. Even in Tears of the Kingdom, figuring out what item to attach to your arrows got to be a little bit tedious after a while, as it blocked combat, and here, although there are several different sorting modes, it can be even more cumbersome because there are just so many echoes to look through. It feels particularly weird that they arranged it in purely one long line instead of segmenting it at least into different types, so that you could scroll up and down between the types. But honestly, while I did notice it, it barely disrupted the fun I had with the game. What did bother me, which many people worried about in advance, but which I frankly wasn't that concerned about, was the use of echoes for combat. Because although you have the tightly rationed sword fighter mode where you can channel Link's powers and cut loose, this mode really is quite tightly limited, and frankly most of the echoes you can choose don't quite do what you want them to do, although partly this might be my fault because I only realised very late in the game how to use them and target them. This makes a lot of scenarios, especially quite high urgency ones like boss fights, feel a little more cumbersome. That is necessary until you get to grips with it. You can sort of approximate a sword by using a sea urchin, and especially toward the end of the game, you can unleash some very powerful enemies to do your fighting for you, but since you don't directly control these characters to the extent you might want, it feels far less satisfying than the times where you just power yourself up and whack things with a sword without having to wait for the keys to swoop back in again. As for all the talk about combat itself becoming a puzzle, that's honestly not really true that often. There are definitely certain times when you need to figure out the right echo or often the right element to unleash against a particular foe, but damage is damage, and often sword fighter mode just ends up saving a huge amount of time compared to anything else. Again, it's not a huge problem, but I definitely found myself stocking up on potions to keep my sword fighter form in play for as long as possible. Still, overall the echo abilities are really fun and definitely give the game a unique feel. There's a lot to be gained from experimentation, and the echoes can be used in multiple ways, including being generated at a distance. Would I want this to become the default for future titles? Probably not, but for this title, it was a really entertaining innovation. What I will say about the echoes though is that a lot of them aren't significantly more useful than the rest. They're fun to collect, and every now and then a puzzle will be solved by using some unique property of an echo that is often only apparent if you actually read the blurb about them on the menu screen. But you will do an awful lot of stacking of beds to get across places, at least until you find a better echo later in the game to replace the bed. The game itself is an odd fusion of traditional elements and new elements. Despite being fairly open, the story is gated in several key ways, and this gives it a nice shape. It definitely feels more linear, but it may well be possible to creatively sequence break. It borrows concepts liberally from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom in particular, but everything is a little scaled down. There are no shrines, but there are a few still world sections to explore which involve mainly combat and traversal related challenges. There's no cooking mechanic, but you can make smoothies, and while there's no dungeon items, you are given the game's powerful devices early on, just like in the Wild titles. I'm not quite sure how well all this fits into 2D Zelda. The smoothie mechanic in particular is massively simplified compared to cooking, and it's one of the game's weaker elements to me. The thing is, cooking felt exciting back in Breath of the Wild, where you were literally scavenging to survive. Here though, having to go through the slow process of crafting smoothies individually feels more like a chore. Also, one unexpected downside of Zelda not equipping weapons directly is that it limits the amount of meaningful drops you can get from treasure chests. Therefore, even for some cool puzzles, you often will find the reward is just some smoothie ingredients which aren't all that exciting. However, that's not to say there's nothing trad about the experience. In particular, yes, there really are dungeons. Now, it must be said that the early dungeons aren't exactly going to light anybody's world on fire. There's a lot of fairly perfunctory puzzles and very linear maps. In one early dungeon I got very excited because it looked like it was on multiple levels, and then I realised it was basically another one of those 5 key dungeons like in Tears of the Kingdom, where you had 5 discrete challenge areas that you tackled separately. Fun in their own way, but nowhere near the kind of complexity of classic dungeons. However, in the second half of Echoes of Wisdom, there are some truly great dungeons. Some of them require you to track elements across different rooms and even in and out of the dungeon itself, and there are some really good challenges. 2 in particular really stand out to me. Having said that, I kind of wish there were more dungeons overall. For all that Echoes of Wisdom has a far bigger map than Link's Awakening, the game doesn't take proportionally that much longer to complete. That said, there are other elements across the world, both sections where you need to do challenge runs in the still world, and caves that are hidden around the landscape and often contain challenges or extra puzzles, which are really fun. Although I've finished the main story, I know there are quests that I haven't finished, and although a lot of them appear to be fairly generic quests to present a particular echo type to a character, some have a bit more to them, and some lead to basically mini-dungeons, which are quite fun and challenging in their own right. I love a bit of whimsy in Zelda titles, and although this is a relatively straight-laced game overall, there are a few goofball characters dotted around the environment who you will run into. The game's narrative is fairly perfunctory, but it does evolve nicely across the game with a few twists and mid-point resolutions, and a major villain who is intriguing and a terrific addition to the series' lore. Anyone expecting anything as revelatory and beautiful as Link's Awakening is obviously going to be disappointed, but it does feel like there's a decent structure, there's some deepening lore, and the antagonist definitely integrates nicely with the series' history while feeling new. Not that easy to do for a series in its 4th decade. As for the map, I won't say exactly what's there to be uncovered, but in general it's fairly standard Zelda stuff. Trailers have already shown the Gerudo Desert and the Sea and River Zora. The game pulls liberally from past versions of Hyrule to populate this one, and so there are some really pleasant surprises of the "oh, that character or species is back" variety, but the tone of the stories is very reminiscent of Tears of the Kingdom, where you wander into an area, find there's some crisis, solve the crisis with some help from the residents, and the people of that area learn a valuable lesson. It's fine and suits modular storytelling as you explore each region, and some of the scenarios are pretty good. It's great to see more of the Sea Zora and the River Zora, while there's one character who cuts a very sad figure, and another section which is pretty funny. But while there are a lot of characters in Echoes of Wisdom, None, I would say, have the emotional depth of a Marin or a Groose, and there's no sense that Zelda herself is changed by her many encounters. And while I think it's right that the first game that has Zelda as a lead character in her own right has Hyrule as the location, given that this is her home, there aren't really many points where it feels any different exploring as Zelda than you might do as Link, gameplay mechanics notwithstanding. In story terms, a couple of people recognise her, but that's about it. In general, while a remixed Hyrule is fun, it's difficult to get quite that sense of excitement and adventure when you're looking out less for what's new and exciting and what's going to happen in this crazy new world, and more you're looking for how the classic elements will be remixed this time. It definitely makes me all the hungrier for future Zeldas to break free from Hyrule, or at least, as with Minish Cap's size mechanics or the Great Sea and the Toon Link games, to show the world in a very different light. One thing I did appreciate but was quite surprised by was the heavy use of side-scrolling sections. These were a very small aspect in Link's Awakening, and honestly I found a bit weird even in the Game Boy original as to why these were included. I didn't realise all the way back then that Zelda 2 was an all side-scrolling title, and as far as I can recall, side-scrolling was never embraced since. But here there's actually quite a heavy side-scrolling element built into the game, and it does break up the gameplay in an interesting way and help expands out the map sections. As with most Zeldas, there's no post-game to speak of, but I know there's at least one huge sub-quest that I didn't get into, so there's definitely stuff still to explore. But I don't mind that really. It reminds me of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, a smaller, condensed experience for late in the system's life that brings back the joy of a classic franchise by embracing a strange little experimental mechanic. I'm not quite sure Echoes is as successful as a version of top-down Zelda as Wonder was for 2D Mario, but then again, 2D Mario was in a much worse position to start with before Super Mario Bros. Wonder came along. All things considered, while I've dwelt perhaps on some of the drawbacks of Echoes of Wisdom, these are all tiny things compared to the overall experience of playing a great, expansive, imaginative top-down Zelda experience. It genuinely feels like a great entry in a genre that has been rested for too long and shows that this format of Zelda can continue as a franchise in its own right. It's also a game clearly intended to ease people in gradually, and yet for more experienced fans, the further into the game you get, the more rewarding it is. I had a great time with Echoes of Wisdom, and I would thoroughly recommend picking it up. So at this point I'm going to say goodbye to the people who don't want spoilers. Please consider checking out some of my other videos, but otherwise, thank you so much for watching. For everyone who is happy with spoilers though, let's talk about the game's second half. So first of all, I thought it was lovely to see the Yeti back, and while I was slightly disappointed that the Hebra Mountains didn't include a glimpse of the Rito, who are one of my favourite of the Hyrule races, the Hebra Mountain section was still incredibly fun, as well as having, for me, the best dungeon. I also really enjoyed the concept of Null as the villain. Taking the gap in the middle of the Triforce as a concept in its own right for the game's villain was really interesting, and I love it when these storied franchises mix up their choice of major foes. Ganon, Ganondorf or Ganon-likes such as Demise make up such a large number of the villains in major Zelda games, and since the game literally starts with Ganon, I assumed that he would have a more significant role to play. My only regret is that when we finally see Null's true form, it's fairly generic and monstery. I realise designing iconic enemies is hard, and especially when it's an enemy that only people who play through the entire game will see. I was reminded of the same feeling I had with Metroid Prime, a game whose final boss is literally the title character, and yet who is utterly unmemorable visually. Still, I thought this was an interesting addition to the lore of the series, and I'd be interested in seeing Null revisited in a future game. One odd feature of the game is Tri's characterization. It feels like they were trying to give Tri an arc of coming to understand Hylian emotions, but I only really realised what they were doing right at the end. It's a pity, as the game could have done with a strong central character arc, but I'm not sure this one quite worked. One character point that was interesting though was fleshing out the reason why Link doesn't talk. I can't remember if this was ever addressed previously so directly in another game. I'm fairly sure a diary entry in Breath of the Wild suggested that he sometimes did talk but preferred not to, but here it's a lot more direct. It will be interesting to see whether they keep this feature for the movie. On the one hand, a mute protagonist would be really groundbreaking and different, but I'd also imagine it would be very difficult to actually tell a story that way. It could potentially be even more powerful though. What I did like was the way we saw Zelda's storyline evolve. Her stint as a fugitive was interesting, and although hardly new for a Zelda game, it was exciting as a turnaround which put Zelda in a different position. I also liked that it didn't last the whole game, and we did get to see how the king reacted to his daughter being called into action. It's not exactly the most emotionally rich narrative arc in the Zelda series, but it gave the game a sense of progression. Okay, at a future point I do want to do more of an analytical video into Echoes of Wisdom, but I'm going to wait until a few more people have had the chance to complete it. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching to the end, and I will see you again for another Nintendo Forecast.